Your next reading is aggregate output, prices, and economic growth. Let us go through each LOS one by one. The first LOS is calculate and explain gross domestic product using expenditure and income approaches. First of all, gross domestic product basically is the final value of goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. In other words, GDP is intended to measure the total size of a given economy. So it is used for calculating the size and growth of a country. So there are basically two ways. There are two ways to calculate it. One is the income approach and other is the expenditure approach. And both methods should arrive at the same value. Well, of course, there could be some differences. So what we do in income approach, under the income approach, we simply aggregate income earned by all households, all companies, and the government of a given economy during a specified period of time. So basically, under this method, GDP is equal to total national income. We'll discuss this in detail later. Plus sales tax, of course, indirect taxes, plus depreciation, also called the capital consumption allowance, plus net foreign factor income, means money earned by US residents in Pakistan, it goes out, and money earned by Pakistanis working in the US, they send back to Pakistan. So net factor income, net factor income, right? So this is what you call GDP under income approach, equal to the sum of all wages plus rents plus interest and profits. Under the expenditure approach, it is the total amount spent on goods and services produced in an economy within a given period of time. So GDP under this method is equal to gross private consumption expenditure. I'm going to write it as C. Gross private investment, I'm going to write it as I. Government spending, government purchases, I'm going to write it as G. Plus exports, I'm going to write it as X, minus imports, M. So GDP under the expenditure approach is equal to gross private consumption expenditure plus private investment plus government purchases plus exports minus imports. So under this approach, it is important to take care. Remember, only include goods and services produced during the period being measured, not the goods and services produced in the previous period or the goods that are resold in the current year but they were produced in the previous period. So they must be excluded. Transfer payments must not be included. What are transfer payments? Maybe sometimes governments provide welfare payments to unemployed people, sometimes job seeker allowance. So such payments are not included. And third important point that you need to remember, only include goods and services whose value can be calculated through selling in the market. Next LOS, compare the sum of values added and value of final output method of calculating GDP. Well, there are two methods for expenditure approach. First one is the sum of value added that captures value at each stage of production, and second method is the value of final output. It captures value at only the final stage. Let me explain this to you. A farmer sells wheat to a miller at 0.40. A miller then takes the wheat and then processes it into a final product, sells it at 0.90. The cost of purchase was 0.90. So basically this is the value he added at this stage. Then a baker purchases this at 0.90, processes it into bread and sells at 1.10. So this is 1.10 is what he sells it, and 0.90 is purchase price. So he adds a value of 0.20. And then this final bread goes to the store. The store purchases it at 1.10 and sells it at 1.40. So he adds a value of 0.30. Now these are the values added at each stage. If you add these, you will get 1.40, or you simply take the value of the final output. So whether we take the sum of values added at each stage or we simply take the value final output, they must be the same. Both methods have to have equal final value. The sum of value added has more detail rather than the value of final output. So here we get this the final number. Here these components are added to give you 1.40. Your next LOS is compare nominal and real GDP and calculate and interpret the GDP deflator. First of all, need to distinguish between these. Nominal GDP represents the market value of goods and services at current prices. Remember, nominal GDP represents the market value of goods and services at current prices. In other words, it uses the actual price paid at any point in time. But when we talk about the real GDP represents the market value if prices did not change over time. In other words, it holds prices constant to separate actual growth from inflation. Let us do it with the help of an example that will explain the idea. Let's say last year automakers sold 1,000 cars at 20,745 each on average, and this year they sold the same number of cars at 21,175 each on average. And as you can see, the number of cars sold each year were the same. So if the output is different at valuation, it was just because the prices were different in both years. So now what is the GDP deflator? Now, the nominal GDP last year was 1,000 times 2745 gives you 20.745 million, and the nominal GDP this year is 21,175. That is 1,000 times 21,175. Now, so real GDP this year is basically not 21,175 if you value the current year GDP based on the base year value, that is 1,000 multiplied by 2745. This will give you 20.745. So this is what you call the real GDP, the value of GDP based upon the base year values. So it captures impact of inflation. So it's just that the prices have increased over the period representing inflation. So we can calculate GDP deflator this way. This is the formula we calculate GDP deflator. Nominal GDP 21,175,000, and the real GDP basically is 2745. That is the value based upon the base year. So this is the GDP deflator. All right, moving on with this example. So if you just see this if base is 100, so this value has gone up to 102.07, which means 2.07 is inflation. So in nominal terms, we see 2.07 GDP growth is in the previous example. This it represents the increase in price level. So nominal GDP was 21.175 million, whereas the real GDP was 20.745. So in real terms, there has been a 0% GDP growth, but on nominal basis, there has been an increase of 2.07. So you can say that real GDP is still 1,000 cars sold. That is 2.07 basically is the inflation in the economy, the increase in price levels, and that's what we have calculated right here. This is what we have already done in the previous slide, same thing. Now compare GDP, national income, personal income, and personal disposable income. Let us discuss these one by one. GDP is the value of all goods and services sold in an economy, and it measures the total income earned by everyone in an economy. There are two ways to see it: expenditure approach and income approach. That's what we have discussed earlier. So value of all goods and services sold in an economy, or from income side, income earned by everyone in an economy. So they must be somewhat equal. So revisiting GDP from expenditure perspective, GDP is equal to consumer spending on goods and services plus business gross fixed investment plus changes in inventories plus government spending on goods and services plus government gross fixed investments. Let us differentiate it by putting it G over here, plus exports and minus imports. And sometimes, but not always, statistical discrepancy. Alright, and GDP under income approach is equal to your national income, we'll discuss it later, plus capital consumption allowance called depreciation plus statistical discrepancy. Now let us discuss what is national income. National income represents income received by all factors of production. So we can write it this way: national income is equal to compensation by employees, what employees earn, employees' income, plus corporate and government enterprise profits before taxes. So I can just simply write it as corporate income, corporate plus government enterprises income, plus interest income, plus unincorporated net income of businesses, some businesses that are not incorporated like partnerships, association of persons. So I can write it as unincorporated net income of businesses, plus rent, plus indirect business taxes, indirect taxes, minus subsidies. These are the government assistances to the businesses. So this is what we call the national income. Okay, now personal income. Personal income is a measure of all household incomes in an economy. So personal income is equal to national income, which we just saw a little while ago, minus indirect business taxes, indirect business taxes, minus corporate income taxes, minus undistributed corporate profits represented in the retained earnings, undistributed corporate profits, plus transfer payments. We discussed this earlier. And then we have disposable income, personal disposable income. Personal disposable income basically is all personal income, this one, minus personal taxes. So personal income minus personal taxes gives you what you call the disposable income. It measures household purchasing power after all taxes have been paid. In other words, it's the money available to spend on goods and services or to be saved, right? Then finally we have household savings. Household savings starts from personal disposable income minus consumption expenditure minus interest paid, if any. So I guess that's what makes a suitable comparison between these. So if you know the formula, we'll know the individual compositions, then it becomes easier to compare these. Your next LOS: explain the fundamental relationship among saving, investment, and the fiscal balance and the trade balance. Okay, savings and investments are basically inversely related. It makes perfect sense. If you could save more, you will invest less. If you save less, that means you are investing more. What you mean is you can't save your money and invest it too. Therefore, investment is a form of spending. So what you spend is what you not save, and what you save is not what you spend. So that's why saving and investment, they are inversely related. So the formula that connects them is GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. C is consumer spending, business investment, G is government spending, and X and M, as we have used previously, are exports and imports respectively. So remember, money saved does not flow into this equation and hence not part of the GDP growth. Okay, and at the same time, GDP is also equal to consumption spending plus household and business savings plus net taxes. So if equation 1 and 2 can be equated simultaneously, that would mean consumption plus saving plus taxes is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, CC cancelled out. Right, now we can rewrite this equation making S the subject of this equation. S would be equal to now investment plus this T can be combined with G and X minus M. Now saving, this is called savings equation. So savings is equal to investment plus G minus T, government spending minus tax, that is either fiscal deficit or surplus, and plus X minus M, that is trade deficit or surplus. So we can rewrite this equation making G minus T as the subject of this equation. I can write it as G minus T as a subject is equal to savings minus investments minus X minus, it's a fairly straightforward arithmetic, no science involved. So this basically is a fundamental relationship among saving, investment, fiscal balance and trade balance. All right, next, LOS. Explain the IS and LM curves and show they combine to generate the aggregate demand curve. Well, the IS curve, also called income saving curve, if you take your real interest rates on the y-axis and real income on the x-axis, you get a curve like this. So basically, the IS curve illustrates the negative relationship between the real interest rates and real income for the equilibrium in the goods market. So points on the IS curve, this one maybe, these points here. These points on the IS curve are the combinations of real interest rates and income consistent with equilibrium in the goods market. Let's say, just put some numbers, 4%, 5%, 6%. For this we have income at 6%, income, real income at 5%, real income at 4%. So basically lower interest rates, when the interest rates are lowered, at 4%, lower interest rates tend to decrease savings in favor of current consumption and tend to increase investment by firms, because more investment will have positive net present values when the firm's cost of capital is lower. When the interest rate goes up, that would do the opposite. Okay, and then LM curve, on the other hand, if we plot real interest rates on the y-axis and if we plot real income on the x-axis, similarly in the previous slide. LM curve stands for liquidity money curve. It illustrates the positive relationship between the real interest rates and the income consistent with equilibrium in the money market. And this very equilibrium in the money market requires that an increase in real interest rate should also result in higher level of income. Remember, to maintain the equilibrium in the money market, an increase in real interest rate should be accompanied by an increase in real income. This ISLM model, it is also known as Hicks-Hansen model. This model helps us understand general equilibrium of price level and see how the market for goods, IS, and the market for money, how they interact. Okay, So this is the first point, let's say call it B. LM curve, for the higher prices we have a point A, for example, and then LM curve for lower P we have another point here, C. So basically these ABC points, now if we take your income and output on the x-axis and price level on the y-axis, so these A, B, C points, intersections of your LM1, LM and LM2 with your ICE1 curve, so these points will represent the components of your aggregate demand curve. As you can see, your aggregate demand curve slopes downward because higher prices reduce real wealth, increase real interest rates, and make domestically produced goods more expensive compared to goods produced abroad, all of which reduce the quantity of domestic output demanded. So this is how we have been able to link ISLM and been able to generate the aggregate demand curve. So there are two interpretations to IS and ILM curve. First, it explains the changes that occur in national income when short-term price levels are fixed, and second, it explains the causes of shift in the aggregate demand curve. We'll discuss as we go along. So as you can see to your right, we have an IS-LM curves interacting. The IS curve here, IS1, it represents the single level of output where the goods market is in equilibrium. An LM curve here represents the money market, the combination of interest rates and the levels of real income for which money supply equals money demand. That is, for which the money market is in equilibrium. That's what we just discussed earlier. The intersection, this point here, generates the aggregate demand curve. The intersection here generates the aggregate demand curve. AD is basically aggregate demand. What is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand for final goods and services in an economy at a given point in time. Your next LOS is explain the aggregate supply curve in the short run and in the long run. First of all, we need to learn what aggregate supply itself is. Aggregate supply basically represents the total amounts of goods and services available in the economy at a given price level. Basically, the aggregate supply curve represents the amount producers are willing to produce at each price level. Right? Now, components of aggregate supply. First, consumer goods. When we say consumer goods, these are goods and services supplied by private firms. For example, clothes, food, services like car repairs. Second, trade goods. When we say trade goods, these are the goods and services for exports like industrial chemicals. Then third is capital goods. Capital goods, goods supplied to other firms to serve as investment goods, for example, machinery, factory machinery, and finally, public and merit goods. Goods and services produced by private firms for use by the government. Okay, now, your long run supply curve would be a vertical line. Long run aggregate supply would be a vertical inelastic curve. It assumes no fixed factors of production. Supply levels will change in response to expected economic profits and losses. It is, as you can see, it is a static curve here. Shifts in long run aggregate supply requires changes in factors of production. Things like increase in available labor hours or change in total productivity factor, then it can shift outwards. All right. Then we have short run aggregate supply curve. So this short run aggregate supply curve, it slopes upward because some input prices will change as production is increased, indicating a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And then we have a very short run aggregate supply, VSRAS. So in the very short run, firms will adjust output without changing price by adjusting labor hours, using more labor hours, and perhaps more intense use of plant and equipment in response to change in demand. So here, that's why it is perfectly elastic in the very short run. And at the same time, as we discussed earlier, that this long run aggregate supply, this is perfectly inelastic. What does it mean? In the long run, wages and other input prices change proportionally to price level. So the price level basically has no long run effect on aggregate supply. So this long run aggregate supply sometimes is also called as potential GDP or the full employment GDP level. So as you can see here in the new diagram, long run aggregate supply is a vertical line because it is static value, whereas the short run aggregate supply can move in response to increase or decrease in price level. Like increase in wages and raw material spending could shift your short run aggregate supply curve to the left and vice versa to the right. Your next LOS is explain causes of movement along and shifts in aggregate demand and supply curves. So remember, just like in our microeconomics, movement along the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve are caused by prices. Change in price causes extension and contraction in demand and supply. I'm sure you remember from your previous reading. Now we are talking about the shift in aggregate demand and supply curve. Let us discuss these one by one. First, consumer wealth. And we're first talking about aggregate demand. If there is an increase in consumer wealth, consumption would increase, hence aggregate demand would increase. It will shift to the right and vice versa. Second, business expectations. It will result in higher investments, hence your aggregate demand will shift to the right. Then consumer expectations of future income. With the hope that there is going to be higher future incomes, consumer will spend more, consumption increases, hence aggregate demand would shift to the right. Fourth, expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy would result in higher demand for goods and services. This would result in aggregate demand going up. Expansionary fiscal policy. It will again increase your aggregate demand. Next, aggregate supply. So let us first discuss short-run aggregate supply. Okay, now if there is a change in labor productivity, let's say labor productivity increases, so keeping all other things constant, increase in labor productivity will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Or in other words, there will be increase in aggregate supply. Input prices. If input prices fall, it will result in short-run aggregate supply curve to increase or shift to the right. Third, expectation of future output prices. So if the prices are expected to be increase in the future, the firms will then expand their production, increasing their short-run aggregate supply. Then fourth is taxes and subsidy. If taxes increase, it will result in shift inward. If taxes decrease, it will result in shift outwards or shift to the right. And of course, subsidies will do the opposite. Now what about the long-run aggregate supply? Long-run aggregate supply is vertical, as you see. It's perfectly inelastic at the potential level of real GDP. So changes in factors that affect the real output that an economy can produce at full employment will shift the long-run aggregate supply. So what are the factors? First, increase in the supply and quality of labor. Of course, it will shift it outwards to the right. Second, increase in the supply of natural resources. Increase in the stock of physical capital. Shift outwards. And of course, most importantly, technology. So they may impact the long-run aggregate supply. Your next LOS is describe how fluctuations in aggregate demand and aggregate supply cause short-term changes in the economy and the business cycle. All right. Shifts in aggregate supply and aggregate demand cause fluctuations in GDP and business cycle. There is a separate reading related to business cycle, so we will discuss that lately. So let us just have a quick view regarding expansion and contraction. So business cycle results from changes in short-term value of GDP. When the GDP changes, basically that is what you mean by expansion and contraction. So let us discuss something about expansion. When we say economy is expanding, what do we mean by this? We mean GDP is increasing, unemployment rate is falling, more people are employed, and capacity utilization is increasing. So that's the expansion phase of economic cycle. When we say contraction, that's the opposite. GDP decreases, unemployment rises, and capacity utilization decreases. So there is a separate reading related to business cycle. We will discuss that in detail as we go along. Now, next, types of cyclical changes in GDP caused by fluctuation in aggregate demand and supply. Let us first discuss the recessionary gap. Now, when aggregate demand decreases, it will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. This decrease in aggregate demand causes leftward shift in demand curve, as you can see. So this reduction in aggregate demand will result in short-run equilibrium below the potential GDP. Let's say this is AD1, this is now the new AD2, and this is your short-run aggregate supply. So you can see here the price level falls as well as the GDP contracts. So aggregate demand curve intersecting aggregate supply curve at short-run equilibrium below the long-run aggregate supply, the potential GDP. So GDP and prices both fall, as you can see. GDP falls as price falls. So what will happen? Corporate profits will reduce, employment will reduce, commodity prices would reduce, interest rate would reduce, and of course, demand for credit will also reduce. Now, this gap is what you call the recessionary gap. Now, let's do it in the reverse order. This is your aggregate demand. This is your short-run aggregate supply. And let's say this is your long-run aggregate supply. Now, aggregate demand increases from AD to AD1, let's say. So this increase in demand is quicker than increase in aggregate supply. So what could have prompted this increase in aggregate demand? It could have been increased government spending, declining taxes, maybe increase in money supply. So they can all shift aggregate demand curve to the right. So what it would do, it would increase the price level and as well as it will increase GDP. Increased prices leads to increased employment. Employment will increase as well as production. So in this case, corporate profit would increase, employment would increase, commodity prices would increase, interest rate would increase, and at the same time, as you can see, inflation would increase. Okay, now there is another concept within the business cycle which you call the stagflation. stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of stagnation and inflation. So basically, it's a combination of stagnation plus inflation. It results in sharp declines in aggregate supply, can cause prices to increase and economic growth to slow down at the same time. Prices level increase, but production falls, employment falls. So this is a very serious issue. Correcting this stagflation could be very costly and it is difficult to address. So existence of stagnation and inflation simultaneously, decrease in aggregate supply can push the prices up. It would result in, here this P is for production, lower production and lower level of employment. So this is a very serious situation for any economy. Then we have the long-term macroeconomic equilibria. I think we should have discussed this earlier. So long-run equilibrium means your aggregate demand curve intersects with the long-run aggregate supply curve. So when aggregate demand curve intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve, just at a point where it also intersects with the short-run aggregate supply curve, capital and labor are fully utilized. So over the long term, potential GDP and equilibrium GDP are equal. That's what you mean by macroeconomic equilibria. Okay, next we have short-run recessionary gap, short-run inflationary gap, and short-run stagflation. So short-run recessionary gap basically it's the leftward shift of aggregate demand curve. This is the aggregate demand, so leftward shift of aggregate demand curve, price level decrease, companies reduce production and employment. Then we have short-run inflationary gap. This is basically the rightward shift of aggregate demand curve, price level rise, companies increase production and employment. This is what we've discussed earlier. And then short-run stagflation. This is leftward shift in aggregate supply, price level increase and unemployment falls. It's existence of inflation and stagnation simultaneously. Economic growth slows down and inflation increases. Your next LOS is explain how a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium may occur at level above or below full employment. So here we go. First, decrease in aggregate demand. So this is your original aggregate demand curve. It falls to 81. So this would result in decrease in price level. Aggregate supply will fall initially, but this would result in lower input prices, which will increase supply again from SR8, S0 to SRA S1. So the new equilibrium point here would mean that the prices would be lower, but the output would be the same. See, this is the new price level, and this is the same GDP as originally. Then increase in aggregate demand. What will happen if the aggregate demand increases 80 to 81? Output level becomes greater than normal price level during full employment. Employment increases above normal level and inflation starts creeping in. So as you can see, the price level has gone up. Then in the third one, decrease in short-run aggregate supply. If the aggregate supply falls, price increases as supply decreases. So output level fall as input prices go up. And finally, increase in short-run aggregate supply. Unexpected increase in supply shifts curves to the right, and output and income increase beyond normal full employment, and the price level decrease. So this can be understood quite easily from the given diagrams. Your next LOS is analyze the effect of combined changes in aggregate supply and demand on the economy. So here we have the first situation when the aggregate demand and aggregate supply both increase, here 80 to 81 and SRAS to SRAS1. So when the aggregate supply and aggregate demand both increase, real GDP would increase, as you can see, but the effect on the price level, well, you're not sure, because it depends upon the relative magnitude of the changes, because their price effects are in opposite directions, so we can't be very sure. Here what we see is when aggregate demand and aggregate supply both decrease, see, from 80 to 81 and from SRAS to SRAS1. So both decrease. In this case, the real GDP decreases, but the effect on the price level depends on the relative changes because of the relative magnitude of the changes, because their price effects are in opposite directions. So we are not sure. At least we know the GDP will fall in this case and increase in this case. Then the third one, when the aggregate demand increases from 80 to 81 and aggregate supply decreases from SRAS to SRAS1, the price level will increase, as you can see, right? But the effect on real GDP is little uncertain. It depends upon the relative magnitudes of the changes because their effects on economic output are in the opposite direction. And finally, this one, when aggregate demand decreases from 80 to 81 and aggregate supply increases from SRAS to SRAS1, the price level will decrease, as you can see, but what would be the effect on real GDP depends upon the relative magnitude of the changes because the effects on the economic output are in the opposite direction. Next LOS we have is describe sources, measurement and sustainability of economic growth. Sources of economic growth: first, the physical capital stock, buildings, equipments and machinery used for production. So increase in the physical capital stock means there would be more economic growth. Increases annual as long as the net investments are positive. Then second source of economic growth is the labor supply. Number of people available to work. So more numbers of people are available to work, then this is a source of economic growth. Total hours worked is equal to labor force multiplied by average hours worked per worker, right? Average hours worked. Third, human capital. Human capital means accumulated skills and knowledge of all workers. And this is something difficult to quantify. Then we have fourth, natural resources. When we say natural resources, we're talking about things like oil and coal. So they can be renewable like trees, or they can be non-renewable like oil and coal. And then finally, the most important, I think it should have been the first, technology. Advances allow companies to produce goods in greater volumes and higher quality. So technology helps you gain output efficiency. It can overcome limits due to diminishing marginal returns. So machines can produce a much larger output by taking in little input. Okay, then we have some important measures. Let us clean up the screen. Measure of economic growth. So growth in potential GDP, growth in potential GDP, it is equal to growth in technology plus growth in labor plus growth in capital. So productivity of labor is something that is easiest input to calculate as part of potential GDP estimation we have seen here. So how do we calculate labor productivity? Labor productivity is equal to real GDP divided by aggregate hours worked. This input is then used to calculate the potential GDP. And what is potential GDP? Potential GDP is equal to aggregate hours that we discussed earlier multiplied by labor productivity. Then we can also estimate the potential growth rate. Potential growth rate is equal to long-term growth rate of labor force plus long-term labor productivity growth rate. Long-term labor productivity growth rate. Okay, now let's clean up the screen. The production function is used to determine underlying source of economic growth, right? It implies GDP and productive capacity, or GDP and productive capacity grows due to, number one, application and discovery of new technologies that will enable us to produce more units, more output by taking in little input. And second, accumulation of raw materials, labor and capital. So these are the two factors that result in growth in GDP and productive capacity. Then there are certain assumptions. Assumptions of production function. First assumption is that the function acts as an evidence for a decline in input when the extra output will be obtained. This is first assumption. And second, a percentage increase in input leads to increase in output. In other words, it has a positive return to scale. A percentage increase in input has a percentage increase in output, so they are positively correlated. Okay then, your next LOS then is describe the production function approach to analyzing the sources of economic growth. Well, production function is used to determine the underlying sources of economic growth. What causes economic growth? First, GDP and productive capacity. GDP and your productive capacity, they grow due to two things. Number one, discovery of new technology that enables input to be used more productively. And second, accumulation of raw material, labor, and of course, capital. Two, there are some assumptions of production function. First, the function acts as evidence for a decline in input when the extra output will be obtained. Of course, when you produce more output, it will shrink the inputs, right? Output goes up, the input decreases. But at the same time, a percentage increase in input will lead to an increase in output. So we can say that they have positive returns to scale. Okay, the next LOS is distinguish between input growth and growth of total factor productivity as component of economic growth. Outcome expected based on production function. Economic growth is restricted by levels of input, as we discussed. If the capital grows at a higher rate than labor, then capital will become less productive. And this is the very reason that growth in the poorer countries, third world countries, will exceed that of developed countries. So basically, declining marginal productivity of capital means that there is a limit on potential growth. But nonetheless, the only way to maintain growth in potential per capita GDP is technology. That plays a very major role. So basically, economic growth results from two primary reasons. First, increase in productive inputs, such as capital and labor. And second, technological advances. Technological advances that allow for more output from the same level of input. So basically, growth is represented by a two-factor production model, A times the function of L and K. What does it mean? That here Y represents the aggregate output in the economy, L the quantity of labor, K the capital stock used for production, and A is the technological knowledge. So you can see it's a factor that can multiply the production. Then some further considerations. Remember, if your input increases, it will have an additive effect on growth. But if your total factor productivity increases, it will have multiplicative effect on growth. But total factor productivity cannot be measured, So it must be estimated. So basically there are two assumptions for this estimation. That first is that the factors of production have a constant return to scale, means if you increase your factor by 10%, factors of production, so your output will increase by 10%. That's what you call the constant return to scale. And second assumption is that the total factor productivity exhibits diminishing marginal return to individual inputs. Means if you increase your total factor productivity by 10%, your output increases by, let's say, 5%. Then if you increase your factor productivity by 10%, then the production increases by 4%. So in other words, the TFP exhibits, the total factor productivity exhibits diminishing marginal returns to individual inputs. So that ends your reading, aggregate output prices and economic growth.